All right. So good evening again, everyone, and welcome to the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural Sites Online Speaker Night. My name is Lenora Henson. I'm the Deputy Director at the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural National Historic Site, and I'd like to thank each of you for joining us. A special thank you to all the TR site members who are with us tonight. Your support is always appreciated, but even more so as we navigate our way through the pandemic and all of the uncertainty that comes along with it. The Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural Site in Buffalo, New York is so happy that we've been able to continue our monthly Speaker Night series during the pandemic, thanks to the magic of Zoom. Speaker Night is our opportunity on the fourth Tuesday of most months to invite experts to help us think about some of the issues that were important during TR's presidency and continue to be relevant today. Tonight's topic, Theodore Roosevelt and the Last Frontier, and the last frontier being Alaska, not the final frontier. That's a totally different thing, although I really enjoyed the connection there. Anyway, tonight's topic sits at the intersection of progressive era diplomacy and early efforts in the realm of wildlife conservation. In many respects, I think it's fair to say that the work that began during TR's administration laid the groundwork for contemporary collaboration among nations on issues regarding relating to the environment, like climate change. In any case, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Kurk Dorsey from the University of New Hampshire to our 2021 Speaker Night series. We couldn't do this without the generous financial support of our series sponsors, so our thanks go out to Erie County and the New York State Council on the Arts. In case you're new to our Speaker Night series, I should also mention that NYSCA's support has enabled us to record nearly all of our speakers for the past 3 or 4 years. So if you've missed any of them, I would encourage you to check out the recordings on our YouTube channel. Before I introduce Dr. Dorsey, I want to mention that we're also joined behind the scenes by Travis Radka, who is the TR Sites Programming Assistant. He'll be helping me keep track of your questions and making sure that our technology is working the way we expect it to. So having said all of that, it's my deep honor to introduce tonight's speaker. I should probably mention that Dr. Dorsey was actually on my master's committee and really introduced me to environmental history. So I'm delighted to welcome him to the TR Sites series. Dr. Kurk Dorsey serves as chair of the history department at the University of New Hampshire. His research focuses on the intersection of environmental and diplomatic history. His 2010 book, The Dawn of Conservation Diplomacy, U.S.-Canadian Wildlife Protection Treaties in the Progressive Era, was a co-winner of the prestigious Stuart L. Bernath Book Prize from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. It's not only a fascinating examination of the first 3 comprehensive wildlife treaties in history, but it's also the first full-length scholarly study of those treaty negotiations. And having reread it, or most of it, very recently, I have to say it's a really enjoyable book, and I relearned a lot of things. Dr. Dorsey has also authored numerous scholarly journal articles and a book-length look at whales and nations, environmental diplomacy on the high seas. I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Dorsey in a minute, but want to remind and encourage our audience to use the Q&A function to submit their questions at any point. I will facilitate the Q&A after Dr. Dorsey finishes his remarks. So with that, Dr. Dorsey, thank you for being here and sharing your expertise with us. I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you very much, Lenore. Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation. I can just tell the audience that I know knows you well that what a pleasure it was to get the email from you. Was it maybe 2 months ago saying, hey, I'm at the TR site and we'd love to have a lecture. And this is fantastic. We love to hear what our students are doing. I'd like to thank Travis for providing the technical support as well. And I just had, since you mentioned the book, I have to say one thing about it. So I got my very first copy of the book just in time for my dad's birthday. So I gave it to him. And about a month later, I said, so what do you think of the book? He said, well, I'm reading a little bit at a time. It helps me go to sleep at night. So I said, hey, my book cures insomnia. So it's got some benefits on top of having gotten me tenure. So,
well, I have to say, I stayed awake as I was reading it. I actually, there were some lines in there that actually made me chuckle, which doesn't always happen with a scholarly history work. So
the editor of the book said to me a couple of years later after it came out, she said, you slipped a few past us, didn't you? And I said, well, yeah, but thank you for the ones you took out. They probably saved me some embarrassment later. So yeah, it was quite a pleasure to publish that book, and this actually both the books. It was a great experience, and I was able to work on Theodore Roosevelt a little bit in that. So I'm looking forward to this opportunity to talk about Roosevelt more. I don't know if the audience can see over my shoulder, but there's a Theodore Roosevelt bobblehead doll that one of my graduate students gave to me, and Lenora told me she consulted on it, so that's pretty cool. Small, and then. Another one of my graduate students gave me this famous picture of TR and John Muir. So the graduate students have noticed that I have a certain affinity for Theodore Roosevelt that comes through. So I'm going to share the screen now, and let's make sure that I do this correctly, because there's multiple screens up. So you see just Theodore Roosevelt, the wonderful poster they made, hopefully not all the small boxes beneath. So thank you all for coming out this evening, or I should say staying home this evening. I'm assuming you're not sitting in a sports bar watching this talk. And because I know that the Zoom experience is not quite as the same thing, but hopefully we can make it equal. And I'm happy to stick around and answer questions at the end as long as you have them. So Theodore Roosevelt is a subject, of course, of in endless fascination. Let me see if I can get the slides to come up here. Here we go. And he actually has some history with Alaska. When Lenora spoke to me about giving a talk and she mentioned the combination of environmental and diplomatic history, I immediately thought of Alaska because there were two crises in Alaska at the start of the 20th century when Roosevelt became president that he inherited. And one he was able to solve, and the other his administration laid most of the groundwork for solving. The first dispute was a boundary dispute with Canada about the panhandle for Alaska into, I'm going to move this over here, with the panhandle of Alaska. And you can see in this map of Alaska, the islands reaching out into the Bering Sea, but then also the panhandle on the eastern part of Alaska with British Columbia. And then the second controversy that TR inherited was the fur seal controversy in islands to the sort of southwest of the mainland of Alaska, and I'll point to those in a minute. These two would seem to be disjointed. For one thing, they were separated by a long, long distance, probably 1,000 miles, but they were really connected because they were both about American relations with Great Britain, because Great Britain controlled Canada's foreign policy, so great power foreign policy, but also they were about the access to resources and control of resources, which was very critical to Theodore Roosevelt's worldview. So I want to talk about that some more. Let's see, okay, so if I can get these to advance more easily. So let me just talk for a minute about Theodore Roosevelt in the world. This image, I think, summarizes the Theodore Roosevelt we've come to know well, certainly as critics know him well. Theodore Roosevelt, the man with the big stick in the Caribbean, pushing smaller countries around. And not only smaller countries, but here he is pulling the navy of the debt collector countries with him. So they had become like toy boats in his wake. And it's certainly true that Theodore Roosevelt had that big stick element to his foreign policy. But I think it's also quite clear that he was capable of very subtle diplomacy. And sometimes subtle diplomacy meant letting an issue just mellow until the time changed so that perhaps there would be a better circumstance for solving a crisis. So as Theodore Roosevelt addressed the two problems in Alaska, he had two things. He had to consider both his vision about the Anglo-American relationship, and he was very much an Anglophile. He wanted to have good relations with Great Britain. But there were also specific legal issues at stake that had long-term ramifications that Roosevelt wanted to be concerned and wanted to take into consideration. He did not want to set precedents that would perhaps hurt the United States later. And what I also think is fascinating about these two Alaska issues is that he really did use nature as a lever to get what he wanted. He was very shrewd in that sense in using his diplomatic tools and advancing the cause of nature conservation. So how do we get to this position? So first of all, Alaska obviously was settled by the Russians. There have been native peoples of Alaska for thousands and thousands of years, but Russian America was carved out back in the 1700s. You see here on the screen two images. One is a map from 1860 of what the Russians thought Russian America looked like. Obviously it's in English, so it's also a British version. And you can see, for instance, that the islands reaching out to the west are not really included. They were not quite important enough to include in the map. But you can see the panhandle is kind of vaguely drawn where it borders up against British Columbia. And then you see the bill of sale, the treasury warrant from the US government to the government of Russia. So in 1867, the Secretary of State, William Henry Seward, signed a deal to buy Russian America from Russia for $7.2 million. And there's the canceled check. It even has a paid stamp on it. So some things are timeless. And with that purchase, the United States gained, well, it wasn't really clear what the United States gained. Critics thought the United States had just gained a huge icebox. So sometimes it was Seward's icebox, sometimes Seward's folly. Other people called it Wall Russia for all the walruses and sea animals that were there. It was also clear that what Seward wanted was the chain of islands stretching from the Alaska Peninsula out west. In 1867, transportation was shifting from sail to coal, but of course, to get across the Pacific Ocean, nobody had enough coal to get all the way across the Pacific Ocean. So we had these funny hybrid ships that were both sail and coal. So coaling stations were critical, and those Alaskan islands were really what Seward was after when he made the purchase in 1867. Did not help. There was not hurt that there was a lot of bribery involved too, but that's a separate story altogether. When the United States acquired Alaska, it acquired two particular problems that would become thornier over the course of the 19th century and then really burst onto the scene in Roosevelt's presidency. So if there are any Canadians in the audience, you probably also know that 1867 is an important year because that's the year that modern Canada was formed with the Confederation on July 1st, 1867. And modern Canada at the time consisted of these provinces of Ontario and Quebec, much smaller than the modern versions, as well as Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And although that was founded in 1867, the idea behind the founding of the Canadian Confederation was that eventually all of British North America would be incorporated into one large dominion in the British Empire. And so the people who were making this decision in PEI in 1867 thought that at one point the western coast of British North America would be part of this country, but the technology wasn't quite there. So this is the same time the United States purchases Alaska, and those are connected. The Russians understood they were not going to be able to hold Alaska against both American and Canadian / British expansion. So Canada comes into existence as a self-governing dominion, but its foreign policy is under the control of Great Britain and control of London. So the boundary between British Columbia and the Northwestern Territory and Alaska is going to be an issue right away. And then the second issue is the trade in sea animal pelts. And this is a northern fur seal looking at you like it's very cute. And if you look closely, you can see a couple things about this fur seal. First of all, it has incredibly dense hair. It's not surprising, or fur, I guess, in this case. Not surprising if you're going to live in the North Pacific Ocean for most of your life, you need to have waterproof, dense hair to keep you warm. Well, that also made the fur of the northern fur seal incredibly valuable for human hunters. And so there had been a robust trade, not just in sea otters, but also in fur seals off the coast of Alaska and down the coast of what would become Canada and really into the United States, but mainly off the coast of Alaska since the 1700s. So Theodore Roosevelt would end up dealing with these two problems, but they had both been present well before his presidency. So let me start by talking a bit about the fur seals. I'm going to read you a quotation from the historian Samuel Flagg Bemis, who said better than anybody what the fur seal was about. He said, "Amphibious is the fur seal, ubiquitous and carnivorous. Uniparous, that means it has one child at a time, gregarious, and withal polygamous." So that's the northern fur seal, and you can see a rookery island for the northern fur seal. And it would be easy to think that what this island is actually a bunch of rocks, but actually all those dark figures are fur seals crammed together. The really big rocks are the big male fur seals. They're called the bulls. And then they get smaller in size. The sort of medium brown ones are the females. The lighter brown ones are sometimes the males, and the dark ones are pups and sometimes young males. So they form these huge rookeries on a couple of islands. The map shows islands. The purple dots are places where the fur seal would give birth and raise its young. And the blue shows the waters in which the fur seals swim, which you can see it's a large extent of the North Pacific. But there are two islands in Pacific, and specifically that I will show you later, that were the center of the fur seal controversy. So the fur seals were pretty remarkable. There were probably 2.5 million of them at their peak. And the hunting of the late 19th century was slowly driving their numbers down to the point that some estimates in the early 20th century put them as low as 50,000 in population. Now, the way the first seals lived was they had harems. The bulls would have female harems up to maybe as many as 30, which meant that there were a large number of males who never got to breed. And they would form what were called pods. They would hang out on the island together, hoping to sneak a chance to breed with one of the females, one of the harems, and the bulls would be constantly chasing them off. The females, which would come to the island in April with the rest of the seals, would give birth right away and then go out and fish because they needed to not only feed themselves, but feed their young. And so they would be out in the high seas maybe 3/4 of their lives during any one year. Now, that was not particularly a problem. The nature had adapted quite well, except for the ways in which people decided to exploit them. So you see the map here. This is a map of, you can see the Alaskan islands, the Aleutian Islands reaching out into the Pacific. And the red dot is the Pribilof Islands. The Pribilof Islands, St. Paul and St. George, were the two islands where most of the fur seals of the world bred. And then they swam out into the high seas to eat most of the time. So these islands are incredibly remote. They were uninhabited. The Russians, when they started collecting seals on land, actually moved some people from the Aleutian Islands and basically moved them to the Pribilofs, where they became permanent residents of the Pribilofs. But before that, there had been no human habitation. If you're a birder, you know of the Pribilofs because it's sort of one of the desired places to go. It's in the United States, but it gets a lot of crazy things flying across the Bering Sea from Asia. And it has these incredible seal and bird rookeries. So seals were on the high seas. They were very valuable. Under the law at the time, anything beyond 3 miles of the shore of these islands was fair game. And of course, Britain, being the largest naval power in the world, jealously guarded the right of its subjects to catch animals on the high seas. Well, the American position was that actually these seals had, in effect, American citizenship. They had been born on American islands, therefore they were Americans wherever they swam in the world. And so the fur seals were American property, even if they happened to be off the coast of Canada or the coast of Japan, wherever they were from. Of course, there were seal breeding colonies in other places, so you couldn't really tell whether a seal was from the Japanese islands or the American islands. It's just most of them were from American islands. So Americans tried very hard to stop what they called pelagic or high seas sealing. The Americans also continued the Russian tradition of clubbing seals on the islands. And here you see what's kind of the brutal work. Go back to that picture of the seal looking up at you with his big brown eyes. Well, these guys are getting even closer, and they have these long clubs. And frankly, what they do is they strike the seal up the side of the head to stun it and then kill it. And you can see behind the men on the left that there are a number of dead seals already. There's a wagon in the background for moving particularly the pelts off to ships that will then take them off to the London market. So there are two ways of catching seals. One is this method on land, which can be very tightly controlled. In fact, the US government gave a lease to a company for 20 years shortly after it bought Alaska. And this company was supposed to live by certain standards. There were government inspectors and only take the young males, for instance. On the high seas, though, there were a lot of females, and they were being hunted by anybody with a boat, mainly people flying Canadian flags. And catching a seal on the high seas is really hard. The best way to do it is to shoot them with a rifle, but then they sink. So the losses on the high sea were really huge. In fact, it was in some cases as high as 70% of the seals killed on the high seas were lost. So the US government did what any reasonable government in the late 19th century did. It started seizing the sealing vessels from Canada. So here are 3 that are tied up waiting trial to be declared the government property. And the US government and Britain could not agree on what to do about these sealing ships. They decided to have an arbitration panel. I should note that all the images I'm using until here, and most of the ones coming up, I'm just taking from Wikipedia or from Google Maps, mainly because those are all in the public domain. These images are actually from the book that Lenora mentioned that I wrote back about early conservation. In fact, this map was made for the book. So the United States and Great Britain went to arbitration in 1893. And the arbitrators were basically faced with 2 questions. The Americans said, these are our seals wherever they go, so you should declare pelagic sealing to be illegal. And the British said, we should be able to hunt seals wherever we want, as long as we're outside 3 miles of the 2 islands, St. Paul and St. George. And as long as we do that, we should get what we want. But the scientists were saying that the seals couldn't handle the hunting that they were facing. So the arbitrators thought about this and did what any good umpire does, which is make both sides unhappy. The arbitrators ruled that hunting on the high seas was in fact legal. These were not American property. But then they ruled also that the hunting inshore too close to the islands was not sustainable. So they drew 60-mile circles around each island, St. Paul and St. George, and said that the pelagic sealers could not come within 60 miles of the island, which of course, well, that made the Canadians very unhappy because the best sealing was obviously right around the islands. So neither side was really happy with the arbitration of 1893. And for the rest of the 1890s, the two countries tried to come up with a solution that each side would like, and they failed. Now, the other issue that Roosevelt inherited was the question of access to the Yukon Territory and the Klondike gold rush. As you probably know, in 1896, prospectors found gold, enormous amounts of gold, in the Yukon Territory up by the US-Canadian border. And when word got back to San Francisco and Seattle in 1897, it sparked a gold rush. Estimates are that maybe 100,000 people went to the area around Dawson City, which was barely even a city when these 100,000 people were trying to get there. And it's worth remembering that in 1896-97, the world was coming out of a really great economic depression, particularly in the United States and Canada, it was very bad. So there were a lot of desperate people, and the idea that you might be able to get instant wealth was quite appealing. But I can imagine if you were thinking to go to Alaska to get instant wealth and you're the last guy in this line, you're probably guessing you're not going to find any instant wealth, but you're there. So what are you going to do? You've paid your passage and you've got your 1 ton of supplies, which is what you needed to survive a year. The Canadians would not let you in unless you could support yourself for a year. And obviously there are no stores. They weren't going to Walmart in Dawson City. So they had to hike and pack in a ton of supplies over the mountains, and then they could go down the Yukon River to Dawson City. So this created a controversy because the question was, were they crossing from American territory into Canadian territory, or were they landing in Canadian territory and walking in? And that, of course, mattered in terms of who was in charge of where they landed and what sort of rules they had to abide by. So there was a border dispute. The funny thing about the border dispute, of course, is that the border was based on a treaty from 1825 between Britain and Russia that said that the border was the crest of mountains that George Vancouver had seen from the sea, only he was wrong. There wasn't a mountain chain along the coast. So based on an explorer who, this, as Wikipedia says, this might not even be George Vancouver, but they think it is. An explorer who we can't even identify necessarily today, seeing mountains that didn't exist, they drew a map that was irrelevant. And so, not surprisingly, once control of the inlets and the fjords became a very important international matter, neither side could agree on what Vancouver had drawn or what the 1825 treaty meant. So this is from the cartoons from McKinley's era, 1899, from Judge Magazine. And there's McKinley. He is the caddy holding a bag called the cabinet as Uncle Sam gets ready to swing at the ball with the Secretary of State, John Hay. And of course, Uncle Sam is standing on the boundary line trying to drive this issue away. And there in the background is John Bold, symbol of Britain, with various British figures. I think that must be the Canadian Prime Minister on his club. And the caption is, McKinley is saying to Uncle Sam, if that club doesn't work, meaning the club of the Secretary of State, try this one. And he's handing the club with the Secretary of War. So even before Roosevelt became president, there was concern that the United States and Great Britain might find themselves at war over a dispute over who controlled these relatively uninhabited spots on the border. The essence of the competing claim particularly came down to a place called the Lynn Canal. And I think if you've taken one of those Alaska cruises that I'm so envious of, and if you have, don't tell me because I don't need to be envious of anybody in particular, whether or not the Lynn Canal, which is on the map on the right, the red dot, was all American territory, which is with obviously the American interpretation. As you can see, the blue line, that's the American proposal of where the border should be, or did it end in Canadian territory, which was the Canadian interpretation of the Treaty of 1825. So you can see the red line on the map. And then there's the green line, which is British Columbia's interpretation, which I think they made up whole cloth just for bargaining points. And the reason that mattered is Lynn Canal, at the top of it, had 2 towns, Skagway and Dyea. And Dyea apparently is no longer a town. And those 2 towns were the closest places, and I use the term loosely, to get to the Yukon by walking and then using boats to go down the Yukon River. So almost everybody who came through the panhandle of Alaska went to these two towns. So it really mattered whether they were Canadian or British or American for controlling access to these sites. So this was the core of the debate. Now, interestingly, in the 1890s, the two sides had decided to treat the Lynn Canal effectively as neutral territory that Canadians could enter without being harassed by Americans. And Theodore Roosevelt's idea when he became president was, we should just let that ride. You know, we've got this modus vivendi we can live with. It's not perfect, but we really don't want to be having a dispute, a diplomatic dispute over the border. And Roosevelt was very clear that this was something he did not want to get involved in, but he was forced into it eventually anyway. So here is the image of Theodore Roosevelt being sworn in as president at the museum itself, obviously not a museum at the point at that time, but from a drawing from a Tennessee newspaper in 1901, there he is taking the oath of office. And so these issues that were theoretical for Theodore Roosevelt now became his real foreign policy problems. And I want to just stop for a minute. I'm assuming most people in the audience are fairly sympathetic to Theodore Roosevelt, but I do want to just emphasize the remarkable nature of Theodore Roosevelt's worldview. On one hand, we have the poster, and I guess the cartoon of Roosevelt is the man of the hour, obviously a very flattering cartoon. He could be the warrior leading the charge up San Juan Hill, for which he was eventually given a Medal of Honor much later, or he could be the peacemaker. Here he is negotiating peace between Russia and Japan. Just down the road is the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, where the negotiators worked, just down the road from me at least. And he, of course, won the Nobel Peace Prize for that. That Roosevelt was capable of taking both positions. The more famous picture of Roosevelt almost doing a mini Colossus astride the globe. And you know, if he could have stood on the globe, he would have, just for the sheer value of the picture. But there he is, sort of dominating the globe. That's very much Theodore Roosevelt's image. But it's remarkable when I think about presidents in my lifetime that Theodore Roosevelt not only was an effective politician and an effective diplomat, he was also a really highly regarded historian, and he carried on correspondence about history with many famous people. He was president of the American Historical Association. I know, a huge honor. You're all wishing you could do that, I know. And but he also was a pretty well-regarded naturalist on top of it. As I was reading up for this talk, one of the things I ran across was that he debated C. Hart Merriam on Merriam's papers about the classification of large mammals in North America. This was when he was, before he was president. And to put Merriam in perspective, it would be like debating the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service today on ecological issues. Merriam was a famous ecologist, and Roosevelt was capable of debating him on ecological issues. So this is a guy with a really fascinating worldview. And when he came to view the world, he had a take, that two-part take. First of all, the United States needed to engage in the strenuous life, and Americans had to engage in the strenuous life. The United States was a relatively weak country in the world, but it was growing up fast in Roosevelt's eyes. And he tells a story in his autobiography that the proudest item he has, and this is after he won the Nobel Peace Prize, was a small pewter cup from his time as a teenage boy going to a camp in upstate New York. And he told the story about how, as he was in a carriage going to camp, two older boys sat on him and beat him up. And he didn't really mind getting beat up because there were two of them and one of him. But what bothered him, he said, was that he couldn't even lay a hand on them. So he undertook boxing and won the camp boxing championship and won, as he said, this 50-cent pewter cup. And it was his proudest possession because it proved that a man or a nation can overcome obstacles if they set their minds to it. And he gave this famous speech in 1899 about the strenuous life, that the United States was obligated to lead the strenuous life, to solve problems. And you couldn't avoid problems, that was just solving them poorly. And then in 1903, late 1903, he laid out what he's most famous for, which is the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And in the Roosevelt corollary, he talked about the maintenance of civilization in the Western Hemisphere. And he said that the United States would not annex territory. That was not what it was interested in. But it did have a police power. Countries that maintained the ties of civilization, that maintained order, that did not engage in what he called chronic wrongdoing, had nothing to worry about from the United States. But countries that had problems with chronic wrongdoing or the unraveling of order, then the United States would step in to bring order to those countries. Now, obviously, this is very unpopular in the rest of the Western Hemisphere. But Roosevelt's vision was that if the United States didn't do that, then the Germans or the British might. And he particularly did not want the Germans to do that. He was less concerned about the British. And in fact, in his time as president, he interacted with 4 British ambassadors, and he got along well with all of them because they were sort of the upper class of Britain, and he respected their vision of empire. So Baron Julian Pauncefoot, Sir Michael Herbert, and then 2 more, Sir Mortimer Durand, who was probably the least favorite among Roosevelt's 4, and then the man in the center of the picture with the top hat, Viscount James Bryce, who was himself a scholar of American constitutional law, and he and Roosevelt had this long exchange of letters before he became ambassador. And Roosevelt really respected them and wanted to work with them, but he also was very clear that the United States would not give in just because he respected British leadership. So he wanted to have a good Anglo-American relationship, but he also was quite frank when he needed to be that the United States was not going to just yield to the British on particular issues such as the border. Roosevelt had his own foreign policy brain trust. Here's the Secretary of State, John Hay, with the immaculate beard and mustache combination. It's been a long time since we've had a bearded Secretary of State. In fact, I wonder if he was the last one, but maybe some current hipster with a beard will become Secretary of State in the next 20 years. We'll have a bearded Secretary of State again. But John Hay had served presidents going back to Lincoln. He was a traditionalist, but he certainly enjoyed Roosevelt's worldview and generally enjoyed Roosevelt's support, although he was softer on many of the issues of Roosevelt. And then, of course, you see in the other picture, William Howard Taft, who was sort of Roosevelt's fixer on many issues, but not involved in Alaska. But Roosevelt's first Secretary of War and second Secretary of State, Elihu Root, sitting next to Taft. And I think Root and Roosevelt were particularly good as a team. They had common interests in hunting and big game conservation. And they also had common visions of America's place in the world based on the rule of law and as opposed to not democracy, for instance, civilization and order. And so they helped Roosevelt frame foreign policy. And they also wanted to support an Anglo-American, what they called a rapprochement. Of course, the British and the United States have had a long and unhappy history going into 1901. The US had fought Britain twice. The British had burned our capital in the War of 1812. The British had opposed American expansion at almost every turn. So there were plenty of people in the United States with long memories of British opposition to American policy. Of course, there were a lot of Irish and German Americans who had wanted nothing to do with Britain. But the leadership group in the United States did want conciliation with Great Britain. And I had never seen this poster before, but the full color poster captures the image so well. I mean, it looks like John Bull and Uncle Sam are getting married there, the way they're sort of clasping hands, and they're, the 2 symbols above them, both the lion and the eagle, and the 2 female symbols holding the flags. This is obviously a very close personal relationship based around the idea of humanity and civilization. And this is a late 1890s, early 20th century move for the US and the Great Britain to set aside their differences and come together around their common problems. And their main common problem was in the cartoon, which is Germany, the Kaiser with his pointy helmet. The cartoon, interestingly, suggests that Britain and Germany are allied, and at the time they were perceived in the United States as allied. So this cartoon is fascinating because the British and Germans are cooperating and trying to steal Cipriano Castro, the president of Venezuela. I'm not sure whether he's supposed to be a sitting duck or the golden goose, but they both want him. And the United States is watching carefully to see what will happen. Venezuela had gotten heavily into debt to British and German, and to a lesser extent, Italian bankers. President Castro could not pay off the debts. And so under the rule of law at the time, the countries that had the banks that didn't get repaid could go bombard Venezuela. They could bombard Caracas until Venezuela paid up. And at first, Roosevelt thought, well, this is the way the world works, and Venezuela needs to be able to pay its bills. And after a while, he thought about it and said, the worst thing that could happen out of this is if the Germans say, okay, you don't owe us any money, but give us a naval base. And that's what really worried him. And the British started thinking about it too, and they had a lot of interest in the New World. They didn't want a German naval base either, so they stopped the bombardment. And the British then were supportive of TR when he proposed the Monroe Doctrine. So the Germans aren't going to be the policemen in this hemisphere, the United States will, to make sure that the German Empire does not grow. So that's the context for how Theodore Roosevelt was going to address his two problems, the boundary and the seal crisis. So if you've read just a little bit about the boundary, you've probably run across the line that Theodore Roosevelt used when talking to a British diplomat. A British diplomat asked him what would happen if the US and Great Britain could not reach an agreement on the boundary issue. And he said he was going to be ugly with Great Britain. And everybody understood what that meant. It meant that the army was going to get sent up to the Alaskan Panhandle. And in fact, there were already some soldiers there. I could not find pictures of soldiers who moved there, but I could find pictures of soldiers who were already there. Interestingly, some Black soldiers who had fought in many places around the world, particularly in Cuba, were there. Here they are getting ready to prepare halibut that they had just recently caught. And then you can see military camp, which is just kind of an amazing setting for a military camp there in Alaska. I can't imagine what it looked like in the winter. But these American soldiers were there, and TR told his Secretary of War, Elihu Root, to quietly and unostentatiously send more troops to the area. He didn't want to make it a big publicity issue, but he understood that the arrival of American troops would be communicated back to the Canadian and British governments right away, and would emphasize to them that he was serious about this, and that if need be, he would take control if the Canadians kept pressing the issue. But it's worth noting that Roosevelt also used beauty. He wasn't just about getting ugly, he also thought about the natural beauty. So the picture, the sort of crowd shot there is from 1899. So in 1899, Edward Harriman, the railroad magnate who made zillions of dollars in the railroad corporations, decided that he wanted to go to Alaska. And it's not entirely clear why. Some people think he just wanted to shoot a bear in Alaska. But in any case, he didn't want to go alone. So he contracted with C. Hart Merriam and said, I'm going to refurbish a ship, find every scientist and artist who you think would be useful, and I'll pay for their passage and supply them. And this isn't just going to be a cruise ship. It had a stable for all the animals they wanted to bring with them. And it had dissection labs and things like that. So it was going to be a scientific / cruise ship. I guess that's citizen science in the modern lingo. And so in May of 1899, they set sail from Seattle with this crew of people that included a range of famous scientists, including people like John Muir and John Burroughs and George Bird Grinnell and Merriam and other people. And they sailed through southern Alaska and then out to Kodiak Island. And some of them went all the way over to Siberia. And so poor Theodore Roosevelt, who really wanted to go on this trip, had just been elected governor of New York and couldn't go. So couldn't get a note from his mom to get out of a job so he could go on his field trip. So he had to go and just read about it as reports came back in. And one of the things that happened was the reports from these people, but also a naval officer who happened to be in the area, were about how amazing the area in the Alaska Panhandle was. What an incredible fishery it was, what an incredible forest it was, that the wildlife was unlike anything else that anybody had seen in North America, and it was truly unique. So Roosevelt in 1902 created the first part of what became the Tongass National Forest, and then created the second part later in his term. And I think it's pretty clear he did that in part because he was sending the Canadians a message, this is our area. We're not just using it for resources, but we're going to protect it. And so the National Forest designation was part of staking a scientific claim to this piece of property. So the Tongass National Forest came out of Roosevelt's attempt to control the boundary question. So in 1903, Roosevelt yielded to British requests for an arbitration panel, but he only agreed on his terms, which is that it would be a 6-person arbitration panel, 3 people from the United States and 3 from the British Empire, 2 Canadians and 1 Briton. So there was no way the United States was going to lose because Roosevelt was going to appoint the American arbitrators. The treaty that the US government signed said that the arbitrators would be jurists of international repute. So I guess you could say lawyers are jurists, and these guys had international repute, but the two were not together. Roosevelt appointed his Secretary of War, Root, his best friend, Henry Cabot Lodge, a Republican senator, and a sort of Democratic silver Republican senator from the state of Washington, who had no interest whatsoever in giving up territory in Alaska. And at least according to some accounts, Roosevelt had his people tell reluctant senators that these were the three people he was going to choose, so that there's no way the United States was going to lose the arbitration hearing. But they were supposed to arbitrate with the British the question of the boundary. And okay, there it was, shoot, it was spinning for a second. There we go, bring it back. So the Canadians appointed thereto, Sir Wilfred Laurier was the Canadian Prime Minister, maybe the one of the 2 or 3 greatest statesmen in Canadian history. And he understood that Canada's claim was pretty weak, but Canada had made a loud set of claims to this territory, and so he basically had to keep fighting for it. The British government, which also recognized that Canadian claims had almost no standing, appointed as their jurist Lord Alverstone, seen here in his wigs as the Chief Justice of the British Supreme Court. And Alverstone did his duty for England. He ruled in favor of the United States on all the important issues. So to go back to this map, the yellow line is the line that the tribunal settled on. And while it wasn't quite the American claims, most importantly, it held that all of the headwaters of all those channels and canals and fjords, all the headwaters were American. The Canadians were furious, but they had in many ways boxed themselves into a difficult position. And Roosevelt had played hardball with them. He was not going to give up this territory, but he was going to give the British a way out by having an arbitration panel. So they solved that problem. And then they had to deal with the problem of the Pribilofs. So part of the issue of the Pribilofs, so here's a sealing fleet in Victoria, getting ready to sail, was that there was a split among American scientists. Henry Elliott was I use the term scientist loosely in his case, a sort of a self-made man who had been going to the Pribilofs since the 1870s. And he was very persuasive. He had some influence in Washington. And he led the charge for banning all hunting whatsoever on the island. More traditional government scientists, guys like Merriam and David Starr Jordan, supported continued sealing on land, but everybody agreed that pelagic sealing should end. Now, the tribunal from 1893 had made the Victoria sealing fleet unprofitable, and so there were fewer and fewer ships going out every year. And so the American position was it should be easy to give the Canadians something to get them to give up the right to hunt seals in the high seas, particularly because not only were the Canadians losing interest, but the Japanese were moving in because they were not constrained by the arbitration ruling of 1893. So Sir Mortimer Durand and John Hay, shortly before Hay died, created an agreement that the United States would give Canada 20% of the proceeds from the Pribilof Islands if Canada would stop pelagic sealing. And the Canadians said no, and partially they said, because you're telling us that it's immoral to hunt seals on the high seas, so you're paying us to stop doing something that's immoral, and we're accepting your money to stop doing something that's immoral. So we can't agree to that. The Canadians were also mad at the British for giving up on the border tribunal. So Theodore Roosevelt again used nature as a lever in 1906 when that proposal was rejected by the Canadians. Here he is talking to the press in 1906. And he said, well, if we can't sign a deal, there's really no reason we should spend money on the revenue service and just lose all this money. So what we ought to do is just what he called have a mercy killing and kill all the seals at once. And that way we can just harvest them and be done with this. It would be a waste of time. And he was going for shock value, and he got it because people were outraged, but he also was making his point to the British, I'm not fooling around anymore. We need to have a solution. The British response was, we are trying, but we can't force Canada to do anything just yet. We are working to get the Canadians to move along. And the combination of the threat as well as the proposal that Hay and Durand came up with eventually formed the basis of a very complex deal that the United States, Canada, and Japan and Russia agreed to. So these are the three key players. Joseph Pope, the Canadian, was the chief diplomat in Canada. So even though Canada did not have its own foreign policy, he was spokesman for Canadian foreign policy. Charles Nagel, who was the Secretary of Commerce for the United States because the islands fell under the Treasury Department, under the Commerce Department because they had the lease on the islands. And then in the lower right-hand corner is Count Uchida from Japan, who was one of Japan's chief diplomats. And the proposal was very complex. Basically, each country that had islands, which included the Russians, that had seals on them, would give the other three countries a small portion of their seal herd. And then in exchange, the those countries, all countries would agree to stop pelagic sealing. And so they would only hunt seals on land. And the theory was that if you were only hunting seals on land, you could kill just the males and leave the females alone so they could breed and rebuild the population. This deal took a long time to approve. Not until 1911 did the Canadian government finally yield under pressure from the British, and largely only because the Japanese came to their, swung around to support the deal because they recognized they would make more money from that than from pelagic sealing, and the Canadians eventually gave in, but not after a lot of dispute between the three countries. The Russians were a relatively minor player in all this. So Theodore Roosevelt laid the groundwork for solving the sealing problem. He solved the Alaska boundary problem, and in both cases, the United States got what it wanted. I should note that the seal population rebounded very quickly, and by the 1950s was back up to its original population estimates of around 2 to 2.5 million. So from a low of possibly 50,000 and certainly no more than 200,000, it grew really quickly under the new management regime. So Theodore Roosevelt inherited this complex set of problems in Alaska, which were a subset of the larger problems he faced as president. And by balancing the power that he had with his sympathy for Great Britain, he was able to get favorable resolutions that kept the British and the United States happy and really cement the alliance between these two countries. He was willing to threaten ugliness, and he did it twice, whether it was literally getting ugly or mercy killing, which he probably really didn't mean, but he never executed it. But one thing about Theodore Roosevelt, if you've studied him, as you know, he famously said about his life as a cowboy, don't draw unless you mean to shoot. And I think people understood that when he said mercy killing, he might be pushed to the limit where he would do it because he had threatened it. And so I think one of the most interesting part about Roosevelt's diplomacy is the way he used the environment as a diplomatic tool. So I think I'll wrap up there and open the floor to any questions. I'm happy to take any questions from people about Theodore Roosevelt or environmental diplomacy or anything I said that didn't make any sense, which will certainly be quite a bit of it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kirk. And yes, I'll encourage anybody, if anybody has any questions, please add them to the Q&A. Questions about or comments or Q&A or chat, we can work with both. I have to say, I don't think I've ever seen the check that was used to buy Alaska.
You wonder if it was signed on the back by the czar, you know, like did they check the signature when it got to the bank?
Yeah. Let's see.
One of the things that deal was really fascinating because so much of Alaska was of no interest. It reminds me a lot of the Louisiana Purchase, where the Louisiana Purchase, they really wanted New Orleans, and France was, well, if you were going to sell you New Orleans, you might as well take the rest of it. And I think it was the same in this case. They really wanted those islands, but Russia didn't make any sense to sell the islands without selling the whole thing. So they just, okay, we'll take the whole thing, whatever that price is. And of course, in the long run, that turned out to be a pretty good deal.
Hmm. So one thing I was thinking about, is with TR and his use of kind of the environment as a diplomatic tool. How is that? Could you talk about maybe how that's continued, how other presidents have continued that trend, or how has that developed since TR invented this tool?
I think in a way, the United States has frequently used the environment and natural resources as a tool. Going back to Thomas Paine in 1776, one of his arguments was that America will always have power as long as eating is the fashion in Europe, because the United States produced far more food than it could possibly consume, and therefore had the ability to influence countries simply by cutting off the sale of food, particularly to Europe. And I mean, that's fundamentally an act of environmental diplomacy. And so I think Roosevelt, in some ways, was blunter than most presidents. I will use this national forest as a sort of way of claiming territory. Although I should say, that's a lot like Lewis and Clark, right? I mean, when Jefferson sends Lewis and Clark out along the river, the Missouri River, and then across to the sea, one of the things he says is, basically by the scientific exploration, you will be staking our claims to this territory as sort of a civilizing mission. Before Jefferson sends them out, how did countries stake their claims? They drove a cross into the ground and put a plaque that said, the king claims this. And now Jefferson saying scientific investigation will be our mark of how we claim territory, and also how he thought that they would separate themselves from the native inhabitants, right? So this was part of the vision that Jefferson had. So, and related to that, I would also say that one of the common themes, particularly in the 20th century, of American foreign policy, particularly with Wilson on, was to emphasize the need for free trade and free access to resources. It's in the 14 points, sort of obliquely. It is clearly in the Atlantic Charter for 1941 that victor and vanquished will have access to resources. I mean, kind of remarkable that the vanquished countries would have access to resources as part of the rebuilding process after the war to make them democratic. And so I think in that sense, Roosevelt had tapped into a larger vein of American foreign policy, which is that we have all these environmental assets. We should use them to make our case stronger as we go out into the world. And even in the modern era, thinking about food sales, whether we donate food to countries that are starving in big sacks that say product of the USA, so we're selling our image, or just selling food to the Soviets in the 1970s at the hope that we can then threaten to cut it off and have influence over them. So in that sense, Roosevelt's ideas are, they fit into a pattern, even if they are his specific ways of using the environment were unique.
All right. So let's see, we have a question about, so TR, I think the question is referring to TR's use of declaring, is it Tongass National Forest. And so he declared a lot of what become national parks and other national lands. How does, were there any other examples where he combined those two, like he did in Alaska?
I don't think so. I'm trying to think if he did anything, because I don't know if there were any other places where there were disputes about ownership and he could sort of stake the claim to American ownership that way. Obviously, he was the person who set aside more land in national forests than anybody else. In fact, everybody else combined. In fact, so much that Congress stopped him from doing it. They passed a law saying he couldn't do it anymore. But he also created all these national wildlife refuges and places that would become national monuments. So I think pretty much in all of those cases, it was driven first, and I would include the Tongass in this, by a sense that there was a rare natural attribute at stake that private business would destroy. But then there was also a political point to be made. So the very first thing he did in that vein was to set aside Pelican Island. And in Pelican Island, some people think that he set that aside in Florida because he was waiting to go to Cuba in 1898 and saw what was going on the coast of Florida with all the birds being killed. And he said, well, okay, so I'm going to make a statement about the way in which we're killing birds for hats by protecting this particular place. It was also shortly after an Audubon warden had been killed. And I think he was trying to emphasize that this was, the federal government was going to intervene when it could. So I think all those decisions were political acts, but they just weren't diplomatic in that sense.
All right. Let's see. Just checking our chat box and our Q&A section. Let's see. I was struck by also, his willingness to let things get ugly, as you said several times. And it seemed like a good example of, in some ways, his willingness, that walk softly, carry a big stick, trying to be, I don't know, he was trying to be subtle in that sense, rather than an overt military.
Well, it's interesting the way that he approached the phrase, I'm going to be ugly, about the boundary. He said it in a way where he was sending a message, but it wasn't in an official diplomatic communique. He could have had Hay send a note to the British government saying, we will use military force if we have to. And he did not decide to pursue that option. And with the threat to kill fur seals, again, this is sort of a statement to the press rather than an attempt to go to Congress or order the Commerce Department to do it. So I think it was not so much subtle, but shrewd way of saying, these are things on my mind. I have not made them official yet, but you're pushing me in that direction. And, particularly with Alaska, I think that Roosevelt wrestled with the question of federal power. And I think as he proceeded in his presidency, he became more and more enamored of federal power and of the belief that private industry was going to destroy things that could not be replaced and only federal power could control it. And so as his presidency went on, I think he got more focused on the need for federal protection in Alaska, which is probably why he added more to what became the Tongass National Forest. And I think he recognized that there was an opportunity to be had that might never come again. I think also when he realized that he wasn't going to run in 1908, and I'm sure he regretted that promise more than anything he did in his life, and he wasn't sure what Taft really was going to do, he had to move fast to get things done. So I think in terms of his threats, he was pretty skilled at knowing when to offer a blunt official threat, we will carry this out, which he did to the Germans a couple of times, and a more subtle threat to the British, you're putting me in a very difficult position. And I think that was partially reflective of his relationship with the British. One of the things I ran across reading for this that was really fascinating was the long exchanges he was having before he was president with a British intellectual who was trying to convince him that Canada had a claim to these territories along the Panhandle, and said, well, at the very least, think about how angry you were when Britain and Venezuela in 1895 got into a dispute about property, and you thought we should arbitrate. Indeed, we didn't, but we agreed to arbitrate. So now we're asking you to arbitrate under the same way. And he said, but that's different because the dispute about that was actually this territory that had never been settled. And we don't really care if you grab the land, but we care about the principle. This border had been clarified in 1825. We had accepted it, Canada accepted it, you accepted it, and now you're changing your mind. And he said at one point, this would be like if the Canadians wanted to arbitrate over ownership of Nantucket. Would we just let them arbitrate, even though clearly they don't have a claim to it? So he was capable with the British of speaking very bluntly. He just knew that he didn't want to put it in official communiques until absolutely had to.
Right. Could you speak a little bit about the influence of, you mentioned, I think, was it Elliott, who was kind of science, but maybe not.
Right.
But could you speak about maybe the influence of scientists in this diplomacy, in this, in these decisions that were made?
Yeah, so particularly in the fur seal diplomacy, the role of scientists is really critical. So in the 1880s, American scientists are the first to start saying, it's pelagic sealing that's driving the seal towards these crashing numbers. They weren't quite saying extinction yet, but managed sealing on land should be producing 100,000 skins a year with no problem because we're taking the males. So we can't get that 100,000 anymore. It's because there's too much pelagic sealing going on. And what was interesting is in the 1893 Arbitration Tribunal, there were 16 volumes full of documents. And only one of those documents, not even a full volume, was the American scientist's position. The US government didn't particularly care about the scientific argument. They were focused on the argument of ownership. And when they lost the argument of ownership, they were casting around the scientists like, we've been telling you that this is a scientific argument. You can win on science. And so after that tribunal, the US government switched basically to a scientific/moral argument that this was killing female seals, which were destroying the population, and they were going to drive seals towards extinction. And the more traditional scientists, the guys who had scientific training, they went to the islands, they tried to rearrange the rocks on the rookeries, they tried to do things to try to cut down on parasites and things like that. I mean, they tried all sorts of things, but none of it worked. The problem was that Elliott had sort of a personality that appealed to Theodore Roosevelt, in that he was brash, he was a self-made man. He had lived on the Pribilof Islands and married an Aleutian woman who had moved there, or had been moved there by the Russians. So he had this sort of on-the-ground experience. And so he and a guy named William Hornaday, who, if people are familiar with the New York Zoo scene, Hornaday is very famous there, the guy who brings us dioramas, for instance, and sort of lifelike enclosures. Hornaday also, because he was a sort of brash, outspoken guy, Roosevelt really liked him. They sort of helped sway the policy away from the traditional government scientists to this sort of ad hoc science that had not a lot of basis in it. And Elliott was, he basically he had years in Congress. So at one point after they signed the treaty, they had a hearing in Congress to decide whether or not the government could continue to kill male seals on land, which all the government scientists said, of course we can do that, because in fact we should, because we need to control all the male seals, and also we need to generate enough money to manage the islands properly. And Hornaday and Wood Elliott went down and testified no, and they brought a trained seal with them. And when they said the name of one of the government regulators, the seal would hide under the chair. And when they said the name of Henry Elliott, the seal would bark. I mean, there's like, they manipulated nature so well, like, nature knows who the real protectors are. So, it's in some ways a similar 21st century story, that the people with the scientific expertise sometimes don't have the PR expertise to take control of the battle, and therefore they lose. And Roosevelt was certainly guilty in that case.
Well, he usually did his PR diligence pretty well.
Yes, he was very skilled.
Yes. So we have a question from Tom. It's bringing into the contemporary world. What is first seal policy now? Is clubbing still practiced?
Not of the North Pacific fur seals. So that in the 1980s, they stopped harvesting skins, but they had been harvesting them up to the 1980s. And part of the reason they kept doing it was because the now the Pribilovians, I guess they've been there long enough that they should be called that rather than Aleutians. That was one of their main sources of meat, was the seals. So they kept that going for a long time, and then the market just collapsed in the 1980s. But interestingly, the fur seal population has dropped pretty dramatically, and estimates are that it may be down to about 500,000, which is still a lot, except that if the peak 50 years ago was 2.5 million, and there's no more hunting going on, it's raising all sorts of alarms about what's going on in the Bering Sea. Is it some sort of climate change? Is it overfishing? It's probably overfishing. So there are probably fewer fish to eat, but there's kind of a mystery. So right now the seals are protected. I don't think there's even any illegal harvesting going on, because I think there might be a little bit, but it'll be hard to sell fur seal fur, because I think, the fur areas around the world would recognize what it is pretty quickly, because it's not like anything else in the market. So they're fully protected.
Huh. Fascinating. All right. So let's, if anyone else from our audience has any questions, please type them in the chat or type them in the Q&A. Give you a couple of seconds there. I'm going to ask one question. I was intrigued by the idea of seals as American citizens. That struck me as very interesting, and I'm thinking of it in terms of immigration and all of those debates. But is that idea ever been used again in terms of wildlife conservation? I mean, it didn't go very far, I guess. But
yeah. It failed so badly that they say, well, maybe we shouldn't try that again, because the arbitration tribunal in 1893 they didn't even take it seriously. Like, of course they're not. They are mammals in the high seas, and just because they come on land for a small portion of their lives does not mean that they are the citizens. But in some ways it gets used more for publicity, I think, than for actual diplomacy. So I think about protection of migratory birds. One of the arguments that's even used today about, you should care about your birds that go down to the tropics, right? Because they're your birds and they're in somebody else's property and they're going to come back. So conservation efforts that you can help down in Belize or Brazil or someplace like that by, say, drinking fair trade coffee, or a coffee that's taken from shade-grown coffee, I guess the example. So they're sort of our birds in somebody else's country. So I think at some level, the idea of a citizenship or ownership is still there. But in terms of a legal standing that the United States has a right to intervene on behalf of any particular species, or that any country does, has not been recognized. But as I say that, it occurs to me that the International Court recently ruled against Japanese whaling, that the Australians sued in the International Court against Japanese whaling and won about, I think the victory was several years ago, but only recently the Japanese basically accepted it. And the Australian position was that as both as signatories to the convention that created the International Whaling Commission, but also just as a country in the world, with access to the oceans, that whales should be protected, and the Japanese are violating the treaty they signed. And so they have an obligation to live up to it. And we have standing, so that's in effect saying that these whales, which aren't born in Australian waters, although they cross through them, are in effect something like Australian citizens. And so therefore we have a right to sue on their behalf. And the court bought that. So I think that idea might be gaining steam. Like I could see somebody making a successful international court case on behalf of polar bears, that we're destroying their habitat, and so we need to do something. Now they'll never be able to enforce it, right? You can't force a country short of war to change its climate policy, but you could embarrass it. And that's, I think, what the Australians are trying to do with the Japanese as much as anything, is just embarrass them in the court of international law.
Interesting. All right, we actually have a question from Aaron. Were there any conflicts with the Native Americans living in the area becoming part of the United States?
I have not run across any issues of them being particularly concerned with whose country they were in, but certainly there was a question with all the people flooding into their territory to cross up to the Yukon territory, which even the Yukon itself, of course, had a large, nobody had a large population in these regions, but the population had a large native contingent. So there were certainly issues about ownership, and Theodore Roosevelt, frankly, didn't care. I mean, he thought that native ownership was not anything permanent. In his strenuous life speech of 1899, he was talking about the annexation of the Philippines. And he was talking about the anti-imperialists who said the United States had conquered the Philippines and then should make it independent and set it free. And he said, the people who believe that also think we should give Arizona back to the Apaches. And that was obviously an example of a ridiculous policy in his mind. So I think that in that standpoint, Roosevelt was in that relatively large group of people who thought that the indigenous populations were dying out in the face of the advance of civilization. And they were not going to be particularly of concern in terms of policy. And I have not found any record of whether they cared whether they were in America or Canada. Canada's policy was less violent, but just as civilizational. I mean, the Canadian record with schools sort of forcing native populations into schools under reservations is pretty close to the American. So I don't think there was any direct concern about that. I should just say as an aside that most of these treaties that the progressives signed in the early 20th century, right up to the whaling treaty in the 1940s, always had a carve out for native uses. The indigenous populations, for instance, were allowed to hunt whales or allowed to hunt seabirds that were otherwise protected for their, as long as it was for sustenance and not for selling on the open market. So there was this sort of strange recognition that the native population had a connection to nature that had to be allowed, even as they basically said, well, this civilization is going away. So that made it, I think, easier to have those sort of carve outs for those people.
Interesting. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions, but thank you so much, Dr. Dorsey. We really appreciate your perspective and your expertise. I am going to mention for our audience that our next speaker night will be Tuesday, June 22nd, and we are actually teaming up with Cornell and Buffalo. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that program, Dr. Dorsey, but Cornell and Buffalo, we've worked with them before, and they are bringing Tejasvi Nagaraja, who is an assistant professor of labor relations law and history at Cornell. He's going to be our speaker night in June. His topic will be labor movements and racial justice from the 1930s to the 1960s to today. For our audience, I'm going to mention Dr. Nagaraja will be joining us remotely, but Travis and I had this conversation yesterday. We are looking towards perhaps a hybrid talk where we might be able to bring some audience into the TR site. And I know some of our folks have been eagerly waiting that. So everyone should keep an eye out for our monthly newsletter. The bulletin comes into your mailbox or email, be coming in the next couple of weeks. Also check our website and our social media feed to keep an eye on what we'll be doing for next month's speaker night, but that will be our topic. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Dorsey. It's been so delightful to reconnect with you. And yes. We have some comments in the chat from some of our folks who really enjoyed your talk. So
thank you very much. And thank you for giving an hour of your time on this. I hope it's a lovely day. It's kind of a lovely day here on the Seacoast. So I greatly appreciate it. And it's so good to see you again, Lenora. And I'm glad to have a chance to talk to an audience of people who like Theodore Roosevelt and maybe other people who have the bobblehead doll. So I'm not the only one.
And if you're ever out in Western New York, please stop by and visit.
I certainly will. Well, I am a graduate of Cornell. I don't know if they had the Buffalo connection back in the 80s when I was there, but I'm glad they have developed that.
Yeah, the ILR school has a connection. They do a great summer program with some of their students, and we've been collaborating with them for our June talk for several years now. So,
oh, very good. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Well, if you ever want to hear about the Migratory Bird Treaty or whaling diplomacy, I know TR did not have much to do with those, but I have all sorts of interesting things about those two issues as well.
All right, sounds great. Thank you again, Dr. Dorsey. Thank you to our audience. Have a great night. Hopefully we'll see you next month.
Yes.
Good night, everyone.